Hey folks, it is March the 26th, and today we're going to continue on with our lecture over post-Cold War. Now, we're still technically in the Cold War in our timeline. We're going to discuss some more Jimmy Carter administration, and then Ronald Reagan, and then we're going to pick back up and finish Reagan on Tuesday. And so I posted the updated notes in the Google Classroom, and it's going to be like post-Cold War part 2. And so I'm adding this set as we move along because we didn't quite make it this far last year because of COVID stuff. So we're getting freshmen here. All right. So, if you remember, we were talking about Jimmy Carter. He enters office, and he's an outsider. He's a very outspoken, born-again Christian, and people are hoping that he's going to bring some values back to Washington, because if you remember, like Nixon and these other guys, they were like, they're liars, they're thieves, they're cynical, and they're backstabbers. So people wanted some honesty back in the government. But when he comes in as president, shortly afterwards, he's going to face problems with the economy. With also, we're not getting a lot of oil imports, so like gas prices are really high. Also, another thing is we're starting to have a lot of our industries are being lost in America, because at this time we had a really big loss of our trade to Japan. Japan was actually taking over a lot of our markets, kind of like especially in like technology, cars and stuff like that. Whereas like today, we usually think of our big competitor as China. But back then, Japan was a major competitor with the U.S. As far as manufactured goods and stuff. And so, and we also talked about in Iran, they had this religious revolution, and the revolutionaries took hostages from our embassy. And so we ended with that. And so, meanwhile, however, in a little country you probably never heard before called Afghanistan, they were actually in a war with a country we call Russia, or the Soviet Union back then. And so a lot of the countries that end with a stan, like Pakistan, was part of the USSR. It's part of the Soviet Union. And they had installed communist government there. Well, guess what? Afghanis are very, very strictly Muslim, and they're very devout. Communism is like anti all religion. And so a lot of people in Afghanistan saw this as an evil foreign government. And so there was a rebellion against this. And so Russia sent in Soviet troops to go try to put down this uprising. And this is essentially going to become Russia's version of Vietnam. They're going to lose a lot of soldiers to the Mujahideen, which was like, now we kind of call them Al-Qaeda. And a lot of these Islamic fighters who are very, very effective against these guys. So in 1979, around 2,000 Soviet forces fought their way into Afghanistan in order to prop up a failing communist government in the face of Islamic partisans. So a partisan is somebody who fights off an invader in your country. Like, let's say if the Canadians invaded America and everyday citizens fought the Canadians, you would be a partisan. And so this war essentially became Russia's Vietnam, as Soviet soldiers bogged down in an unwinnable war against guerrilla forces. So these guys, much like in Afghanistan today, were hiding out in caves and mountains and using hit and run tactics against the Soviets. The Soviets were bitterly hated by the Afghan forces because they saw them as anti-religious foreigners, remember? So they saw this essentially as a crusade against the Soviets. Carter, however, responded to this invasion by refusing to sign an arms limitation treaty with Russia. You might not remember we had the SALT treaty that was signed earlier to limit nuclear weapons. Well, he refused to sign a new one with Russia because he's like, you guys are being aggressive. He's also going to suspend grain shipments to Russia. The Soviet style of agriculture was failing miserably. They were facing still, even all the way into the 70s, and we're going to see in the 80s too, food shortages. A lot of it had to do with instead of allowing the local farmers decide what to grow and how to grow it, they were being told by their national government what exactly to do on each farm. And it led to such inefficiency that the country was just doing really, really poor, running out of food. And also Carter allowed the CIA to give the Afghan fighters state-of-the-art weaponry, including anti-aircraft missiles and stuff like that, which is going to become a problem later where we realize, oh, shoot, a lot of these guys, well, no, the Stinger missiles are actually going to come later during Saddam Hussein, but they are going to be given a lot of American state-of-the-art weaponry. CIA agents are actually going to go in and help give them money and weapons, stuff like that. During this war, a little guy called Osama bin Laden is going to become a hero to a lot of the Afghanis. And he's actually going to be an American ally, oddly enough, during this time.
Whoa.
Yeah. But don't worry, he didn't like us. He's dead now. So we were doing basically what the Russians did. When we were in Vietnam, the Russians were helping out the Vietnamese, giving them weapons and training and money and stuff like that. Now we're doing the same thing. So the Soviet war in Afghanistan would last for 9 years and leave nearly 15,000 dead communist soldiers, not to mention countless civilian lives, because in wars, it's always the civilians who suffer the most. And of course, I don't know the number for the Afghani fighters. Like a lot of them were like different tribes, and not even all the tribes were friendly with one another, but they did have a common enemy. So. All right. So moving on from there. So during the Carter administration, this whole mess with Iran was becoming a nightmare for him. In fact, it's going to be such a big deal that he's going to spend a lot of his energy trying to figure out a way out of this problem. And then that's going to lead us to an operation where he's going to authorize to have special forces, and I think CIA agents, try to go into Iran and extract our hostages out of there to rescue them. And as you can see here, it didn't turn out that well. So meanwhile, Americans demanded a release of the 66 U.S. citizens and military personnel who were still held captive in Iran. So the military personnel were like Marines. Marines are in charge of guarding our embassies. So, they took the guards. Ayatollah Khomeini, like the new religious leader and revolutionary leader of Iran, demanded the return of both the Shah and his family's wealth, the lives of the hostages. So during the time of all this, the leader of Iran, the Shah, who was our ally, needed cancer treatment. So we allowed him and his family to come over here for the cancer treatment. Then the Iranians had this revolution. They deposed their government there, and we allowed the Shah and his family to stay here. And they had an immense amount of wealth as well, which was in foreign bank accounts. The Ayatollah said, give us back this guy we hate and all of his money, and we'll let your hostages go. Well, we, of course, didn't do that. Carter froze Iranian assets. So, like, if they had money here in one of our banks or a company here, we told them they couldn't have it back. Like, we've done similar things to other countries during sanctions. He led an international trade embargo against Iran. An embargo is when you refuse any trade in or out of a country. And that's still kind of in effect today. But a lot of nations really needed Iranian oil, especially Europe. Europe's really close to Iran. And so they refused to participate. So Iran was still able to get in some funds, but not as much as they wanted. In spring of 1980, Carter elected for a rescue attempt. He was coming up on re-election. He needed something to help him out. And he was personally torn to try to help out these hostages. The operation was called off, however, due to several helicopters having severe malfunctions, which led to a helicopter wreck and the death of 8 soldiers. And so since the aircraft weren't working, they had to crash land, had to do a rescue operation on them. And so this blew up. It was televised afterwards. A lot of Americans found out. Of course, the Iranians found out. So that kind of blew our cover for trying to get the hostages. The hostages would not be released until Carter relinquished several $billions to the Iranians in 1981. This is one of his last acts as president. He did this right before he left office. No. Because he lost the re-election. It was like in January. The new president was about to be sworn in. So he's like, okay. Take all this money. Just please let them go. So, and they did. Several $billions.
For how many people?
66. So. Yeah, and these guys, while they were kept hostage, they were constantly interrogated. I'm not sure if they were tortured. I'm not sure, but they were actually kept in basically a cellar that had such a short ceiling you couldn't stand up. They were kept in the dark for like weeks at a time and stuff like that. So they weren't very happy. They were treated as spies as well. And usually embassies do have a lot of data collection and stuff like that on the country, sometimes spying. So, makes sense. Seems like a pretty normal place to do it. All right, so that problem is kind of solved, but Jimmy Carter is going to be very unpopular now. They're going to be like, the economy's terrible. He had no friends in Washington. He didn't work with Congress or anybody. He was a complete outsider. Internationally, we were facing this major problem. Didn't see any success against trying to end the Cold War. And so people really wanted something different. And they're going to get that with Ronald Reagan. In many ways, he's going to be a polar opposite to Carter. We talked about Reagan a bit before when we talked about McCarthyism, because he was one of those guys who was a whistleblower. He's like, hey, watch out, everybody. There are some communist sympathizers here in Hollywood. But since then, he's going to be governor of California, and he's going to really become famous when he challenges Ford for the presidential nomination for the Republicans.
Is he the one that did the drugs?
The war on drugs. Well, Nixon's going to be the one who starts the war on drugs. And he's largely going to be influenced by the United Nations. In fact, that's where we got our class system for class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4 drugs. We got that from the UN. Nixon adopted that and applied it to America. But yeah, Reagan is going to dump a lot of money into it. And it's going to be during this time period where different states and courts are just going to decide to start doing things like they're going to invent things like no-knock warrants and stuff like that, or leveraging people's property against them to get them in jail and stuff. So this is when policing is going to start changing and things like that. So Ronald Reagan, born to a low-income family. I think his dad was a shoe salesman or something like that. He's gonna work his way through college on a football scholarship. He served in World War II, but he wasn't a fighter. I think he was actually helping make war films for the Army. And then he went on to be, he's an actor in several films, but he's going to mostly, he's going to be the leader of a Screen Actors Guild in Hollywood. You can think of that kind of like a group of actors who are trying to push for each other's rights and stuff like that in the industry. Reagan gained national attention for his role as governor in California. He was a 2-term governor, as he used his power in that office to subdue riots and foster financial prosperity for the state. So you're going to see a lot of California's economy really bloom during that time. And also, when a lot of the nation was having a lot of riots and violence and stuff like that, he would use the National Guard and the state police to bring back order and stuff like that. So people were like, people saw him as a sign of stability. Republicans gravitated around him as their 1980 presidential candidate. So they picked him as the candidate this time. They're like, well, Ford lost pretty bad. We'll pick Reagan. It was due to his criticism of governmental norms. Remember, people were still pretty hard set thinking that the government was messing everything up, and a call for conservative values. So that could be a call of conservative values, both to a lot of Christian movements got behind him as a candidate, but also a lot of people who wanted what we call fiscal responsibility, like spend less money, stuff like that. He was a pretty good speaker. I guess you'd have to be if you're an actor. And he called for being more confrontational with the Soviets, not necessarily going to war, but not backing down at the negotiations table. He's going to have a very massive election victory. He's going to win 489 electoral college votes to Carter's 49. Carter won his home state and a few others, but almost the whole map went towards Reagan. And so he was very, very popular. And of course, Carter was very unpopular. So then you have popularity versus unpopularity. That's what happened. Thing is, he's going to win even bigger in his next one. So he's going to go up there again. All right. So this guy here, we talk about him a little bit next year in economics. It's Milton Friedman. He's the guy who is going to be one of the economic advisors to Reagan. Milton Friedman was, he's kind of like a throwback to really old school laissez-faire economics. The idea that you need to let people make individual decisions as far as where their money goes and essentially stay out of the way. So in his first term, Reagan cut income taxes by 25% in an effort to help America's economy. He argued that overtaxation lessened business incentives and also the buying power of everyday citizens. And that goes back to Milton Friedman. If people have more money, they're able to use the money in more efficient ways, and that overall helps the economy. To reduce federal spending and the deficit. So the deficit's this. You're spending more than you're taking in. There's only two ways to fix that. It's either spend less or take in more money. So they chose to do this by they chose to do this by cutting things like Medicare and Social Security, which some critics saw, especially during the Cold War, they saw these as something that was a little too close to socialism, something the Soviets did. However, though, since we were still at the height of the Cold War and an arms race, our military spending was still super high. So we cut taxes, taking in less money, but we were still spending a lot. That didn't look too good. By 1983, the U.S. economy was showing signs of recovery, and inflation began to decrease. That was good. Americans, ever since the 70s, if you remember, and a lot of it was a product of the Vietnam War, the economy was doing terrible. But now, towards the end of Reagan's first term, it was doing a lot better. So people said, I guess this stuff's working. In 1984, he would run for re-election against Walter Mondale. And it's going to be in his second term, which we'll pick up on next week, is when we're going to talk a lot about his interactions with the Soviets, but also a scandal that's going to pop up during his administration as well, known as the Iran-Contra scandal. But we'll get to that next Tuesday. That's going to end the lecture for today. So we're going to meet again on Tuesday, then Thursday, and that's about it. Remember, no school next Friday. That's Good Friday. So on a 3-day weekend. All right. See you later.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
No.